He thought he could humiliate her in front of an entire lecture hall, but he had no idea he was about to expose his own flaw instead. The advanced calculus class at Westbridge University was known for its intensity, and at exactly 9 a.m., every seat was filled with graduate students who had spent years proving they belonged there. At the center of it all stood Professor Richard Harrington, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond campus walls, a published genius, a department head, and someone who made it very clear that only the best deserved his attention. That morning, his voice cut through the room as he filled the board with a complex equation, symbols stacking into something that looked more like a puzzle than mathematics. Students scribbled quickly, trying to keep up, careful not to fall behind, because in this room, hesitation was weakness. Near the back, almost invisible among the rows of focused faces, stood Sarah Mitchell. She wasn't seated like the others. She stood quietly near the wall, holding a clipboard and wearing a simple gray cardigan over a plain blouse, the kind of outfit no one noticed twice. Most students assumed she was part of the cleaning staff or maintenance, someone who didn't belong in a room like this. And that assumption suited her just fine. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the board, following every step of the equation with calm precision. Harrington paused mid-explanation, tapping the chalk against the board with a faint smirk. "This," he said, stepping aside, "is where most people fail." A few students shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what he meant. The problem wasn't just difficult, it was designed to expose gaps in understanding. Silence stretched across the room as no one volunteered to answer. Then, almost without thinking, Sarah spoke. "Excuse me, wouldn't that transformation create a conflict in the boundary condition?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried just enough to reach the front of the room. Heads turned instantly. Dozens of eyes locked onto her. A ripple of confusion moved through the class. Who was she? Harrington slowly turned, his expression unreadable at first, then shifting into something sharper, something almost amused. "And you are?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with condescension. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Sarah Mitchell." A pause. "Facilities." A few quiet chuckles broke out. Harrington's smile widened slightly, as if he had just been handed an opportunity he couldn't ignore. "Facilities," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "And you believe you've identified an issue in my solution?" The room grew still again, tension building in the silence. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her clipboard, but her gaze didn't drop. "I'm not saying it's wrong," she replied carefully, "just that it might not hold under certain conditions." That was all it took. Harrington stepped away from the board, gesturing toward it with an open hand. "Well then," he said, his voice now louder, carrying to every corner of the lecture hall, "since you seem to have such insight, why don't you come up here and show us?" A wave of low laughter followed, students exchanging glances, some amused, others uncomfortable. They had seen this before. Harrington didn't miss opportunities like this. This was a demonstration, a lesson, and Sarah had just volunteered to be the example. For a moment, she didn't move. The distance from the back wall to the front of the room suddenly felt longer than it should have. The polished wood floor reflected the overhead lights, every step she was about to take would echo. Harrington waited, arms crossed, completely certain of how this would end. "Take your time," he added, a hint of mock generosity in his tone. "We're all eager to learn." More quiet laughter. Sarah inhaled slowly, then stepped forward. One step. Then another. The sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder with every movement. Conversations died down. Phones lowered. Even the students who had been smirking moments ago began to watch more closely. There was something about the way she moved, not rushed, not hesitant anymore, just steady. When she reached the front, Harrington handed her the chalk, his expression confident, almost bored. To him, this was already over. Sarah looked at the board. The equation stretched across it, complex but familiar, like something she had seen 1,000 times before. For a brief moment, her hand hovered in the air. Then it stilled. The room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the awkward pause, the confirmation that she didn't belong there. But what happened next was something none of them were prepared for. He thought he could humiliate her in front of an entire lecture hall, but he had no idea he was about to expose his own flaw instead. The advanced calculus class at Westbridge University was known for its intensity, and at exactly 9 a.m., every seat was filled with graduate students who had spent years proving they belonged there. At the center of it all stood Professor Richard Harrington, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond campus walls, a published genius, a department head, and someone who made it very clear that only the best deserved his attention. That morning, his voice cut through the room as he filled the board with a complex equation, symbols stacking into something that looked more like a puzzle than mathematics. Students scribbled quickly, trying to keep up, careful not to fall behind, because in this room, hesitation was weakness. Near the back, almost invisible among the rows of focused faces, stood Sarah Mitchell. She wasn't seated like the others. She stood quietly near the wall, holding a clipboard and wearing a simple gray cardigan over a plain blouse, the kind of outfit no one noticed twice. Most students assumed she was part of the cleaning staff or maintenance, someone who didn't belong in a room like this. And that assumption suited her just fine. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the board, following every step of the equation with calm precision. Harrington paused mid-explanation, tapping the chalk against the board with a faint smirk. "This," he said, stepping aside, "is where most people fail." A few students shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what he meant. The problem wasn't just difficult, it was designed to expose gaps in understanding. Silence stretched across the room as no one volunteered to answer. Then, almost without thinking, Sarah spoke. "Excuse me, wouldn't that transformation create a conflict in the boundary condition?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried just enough to reach the front of the room. Heads turned instantly. Dozens of eyes locked onto her. A ripple of confusion moved through the class. Who was she? Harrington slowly turned, his expression unreadable at first, then shifting into something sharper, something almost amused. "And you are?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with condescension. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Sarah Mitchell." A pause. "Facilities." A few quiet chuckles broke out. Harrington's smile widened slightly, as if he had just been handed an opportunity he couldn't ignore. "Facilities," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "And you believe you've identified an issue in my solution?" The room grew still again, tension building in the silence. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her clipboard, but her gaze didn't drop. "I'm not saying it's wrong," she replied carefully, "just that it might not hold under certain conditions." That was all it took. Harrington stepped away from the board, gesturing toward it with an open hand. "Well then," he said, his voice now louder, carrying to every corner of the lecture hall, "since you seem to have such insight, why don't you come up here and show us?" A wave of low laughter followed, students exchanging glances, some amused, others uncomfortable. They had seen this before. Harrington didn't miss opportunities like this. This was a demonstration, a lesson, and Sarah had just volunteered to be the example. For a moment, she didn't move. The distance from the back wall to the front of the room suddenly felt longer than it should have. The polished wood floor reflected the overhead lights, every step she was about to take would echo. Harrington waited, arms crossed, completely certain of how this would end. "Take your time," he added, a hint of mock generosity in his tone. "We're all eager to learn." More quiet laughter. Sarah inhaled slowly, then stepped forward. One step. Then another. The sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder with every movement. Conversations died down. Phones lowered. Even the students who had been smirking moments ago began to watch more closely. There was something about the way she moved, not rushed, not hesitant anymore, just steady. When she reached the front, Harrington handed her the chalk, his expression confident, almost bored. To him, this was already over. Sarah looked at the board. The equation stretched across it, complex but familiar, like something she had seen 1,000 times before. For a brief moment, her hand hovered in the air. Then it stilled. The room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the awkward pause, the confirmation that she didn't belong there. But what happened next was something none of them were prepared for. For several long seconds after Sarah Mitchell returned to the back of the room, no one spoke, as if the entire class was waiting for Professor Harrington to restore order, to explain away what had just happened, but he did not move. His eyes remained locked on the board, tracing the lines she had written, searching for a flaw that refused to reveal itself. The authority he carried into the room that morning now felt distant, almost uncertain, and the silence that followed was no longer respectful, it was questioning. A student in the second row finally shifted in his seat, glancing from the board to Harrington, then back again. "Professor, is that method valid?" he asked carefully, his voice breaking the stillness but not the tension. Harrington inhaled slowly, straightening his posture as if pulling himself back into position. "It is unconventional," he replied, choosing his words with precision, though the hesitation behind them did not go unnoticed. Another student leaned forward, eyes still fixed on the equation. "But it resolves the boundary issue, right?" he pressed. A quiet ripple moved through the room again, not laughter this time, but curiosity, genuine and growing. Harrington picked up a piece of chalk, turning back to the board as if to reclaim it, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate. He pointed to a section of Sarah's work, tapping lightly. "This step," he said, "relies on an assumption that is not standard in most approaches." His voice was steady, but it lacked the sharp confidence from before. From the back, Sarah remained still, her expression calm, her gaze steady. She did not interrupt. She did not correct him. She simply watched. A student near the front frowned slightly. "But if the assumption holds," he said, "then the rest follows cleanly." Heads began to nod. Pens moved again, not to copy Harrington's original method, but to rewrite what Sarah had shown them. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The room was no longer following him. It was following her work. Harrington noticed it. Of course he did. He had spent years commanding attention, shaping minds, controlling the pace of every lecture, and now, without a word from her, that control was slipping. He set the chalk down again, turning to face the class, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the back of the room where Sarah stood. There was a question there now, one he had not expected to ask. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, the title sounding unfamiliar on his tongue, "how did you arrive at that transformation?" The room shifted again, all attention returning to her. This time, there was no laughter, no smirking, only anticipation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if she were deciding whether stepping forward again was necessary. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It is a variation of a method used in nonlinear systems," she explained. "You adjust the transformation to stabilize the boundary instead of forcing it to fit." A student's eyes widened. "That is, not covered in this course," he said under his breath. Sarah gave a small nod. "It usually is not." Harrington studied her more closely now, the pieces beginning to shift into place in a way he had not anticipated. "And where exactly," he asked slowly, "did you learn that?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the ones before it, because this was no longer about the equation. This was about her. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her clipboard, but her posture remained steady. "I studied mathematics," she said simply. A pause. "A while ago." The understatement only deepened the tension. Students exchanged glances, confusion mixing with realization. This was not someone who had guessed her way through a problem. This was someone who understood it at a level they were still trying to reach. Harrington's gaze sharpened. "Studied, where?" he pressed. Another pause. Sarah's eyes met his for the first time without hesitation. "Here," she said. The word landed quietly, but its impact was immediate. A murmur spread through the room, louder now, no longer contained. "Wait, she went here. That does not make sense, then why is she?" The questions remained unfinished, hanging in fragments as students tried to reconcile the image they had built of her with the reality unfolding in front of them. Harrington did not speak right away. He simply stared at her, the weight of that single answer settling in. Because in that moment, he realized something he had not considered before. He had not just underestimated her ability. He had failed to see her entirely. And as the room filled with quiet realization, the balance of power that had once seemed so clear now felt completely reversed, leaving only one question lingering in the silence: who exactly had been out of place in this room all along? The murmur did not fade this time, it grew, spreading across the lecture hall like a quiet wave that refused to settle. And Professor Harrington could feel it slipping further beyond his control with every passing second. "Here," he repeated, his voice lower now, less certain than before, as if the word itself carried more weight than he had expected. Sarah did not move from where she stood, her posture calm, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she answered simply. No explanation followed, no attempt to fill the silence she had just created. That silence, however, began to shift into something sharper, something that pressed against the room with a new kind of tension. Students glanced at one another, their earlier assumptions unraveling piece by piece. The woman they had dismissed as staff, someone invisible, someone unqualified, had just claimed a place among them, not as an outsider, but as someone who had once walked the same path, perhaps even further. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. He stepped away from the board, studying her now with a level of attention he had not given her before. "That would mean," he said slowly, "you completed the program." It was not quite a question, but it demanded an answer. Sarah hesitated, just briefly, then nodded once. "I did." The simplicity of her response only deepened the unease in the room. A student near the front leaned back in his chair, processing the shift. "Then why are you?" he began, but stopped himself before finishing the question, the implication hanging unspoken. Sarah's gaze softened slightly, not offended, not defensive, just aware. "Life does not always follow the same path," she said quietly. There was no bitterness in her tone, no attempt to justify or explain beyond that. Just a statement, grounded and complete. The room absorbed her words in silence. Harrington looked at her differently now, the calculation in his expression no longer aimed at proving her wrong, but at understanding something he had missed. For years, he had built his reputation on precision, on the ability to identify flaws quickly and decisively, and yet here stood a variable he had failed to account for entirely. He turned back toward the board, staring again at the solution she had written, but this time his perspective had shifted. It was no longer a challenge to his authority. It was evidence. Evidence that someone he had dismissed without a second thought possessed a level of clarity that demanded acknowledgement. A long breath left him. As he reached for the chalk once more, but instead of rewriting or correcting, he simply traced one of her steps with the tip, following the logic she had laid out. "This adjustment," he said slowly, addressing the class again, "changes the entire structure of the solution." His voice was different now, quieter, more measured, stripped of the earlier edge. Students leaned forward again, but not with the same tension as before. This time, it was a tension without fear. "It stabilizes the condition without forcing the constraint," another student added, almost thinking out loud. Harrington nodded faintly, still studying the board. "Yes," he said. The word landed softly, but it carried more weight than anything he had said earlier that morning. Across the room, Sarah remained still, her presence no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed. She had not stepped forward again, had not tried to claim the moment, and yet the moment had settled around her anyway. A shift had occurred, not just in the solution on the board, but in the way every person in that room now saw her. Harrington finally turned back to face the class, but his gaze did not sweep across them as it usually did. It returned to her. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, the formality now deliberate, "would you be willing to elaborate further on this method?" The request was subtle, but unmistakable. It was no longer a challenge. It was an invitation. The room went completely still again, but this time the silence felt different. It was not heavy with judgment or expectation. It was open, waiting. Sarah looked at him for a moment, reading the shift in his tone, the change in the room, the quiet recognition that had replaced the earlier mockery. She could feel every eye on her again, but it did not weigh on her the same way. Not anymore. For a brief second, it seemed as though she might decline, step back into the quiet space she had occupied before, let the moment pass without expanding it. But then she moved. Not forward with hesitation, but with quiet purpose. And as she took that first step toward the board again, the room held its breath, because something deeper than a single solution was about to unfold, something that would not only change how they saw her, but how they understood the line between appearance and truth. As Sarah Mitchell stepped forward again, the shift in the room became undeniable, not loud or dramatic, but deep, like something settling into place beneath the surface that no one could ignore anymore. The same wooden floor echoed beneath her steps, but this time, there were no whispers, no quiet laughter trailing behind her, only a focused silence that followed her every movement. Professor Harrington did not move to meet her halfway. He remained where he was, slightly to the side of the board, giving her space without needing to say it. It was a small gesture, but in a room like this, it meant everything. Sarah reached the board and picked up the chalk once more, her fingers steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had done this countless times before, not in front of an audience, but in moments no one had ever witnessed. She did not rush. She did not look back. She simply began. "The standard approach assumes stability after the transformation," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for the room to hear, "but that only works if the boundary conditions remain consistent." Her hand moved as she spoke, drawing a clean line through the earlier step, not erasing it, but reframing it, placing it into context rather than dismissing it outright. Several students leaned forward immediately, their eyes tracking every symbol. "If you shift the transformation here," she continued, marking a new path beside the original, "you allow the system to adjust instead of forcing it to comply." The difference was subtle at first glance, almost easy to miss, but as the structure unfolded, the clarity became undeniable. One student in the front row quietly whispered, "That simplifies everything." Another nodded, his pen already moving again, copying her work with urgency. Harrington watched in silence, his expression no longer guarded, but intent, as if he were studying not just the method, but the mind behind it. Sarah paused briefly, then added the final connecting step, the one that aligned the entire equation into something balanced, stable, complete. When she stepped back this time, she did not retreat immediately. She allowed the solution to sit there, fully visible, fully understood. The room did not erupt into noise. It did not need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any reaction, filled with recognition, with the quiet realization that they had just witnessed something rare. A method that was not only correct, but refined beyond what they had been taught. Harrington finally stepped forward, his eyes moving across the board with a focus that bordered on respect. He did not reach for the chalk right away. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady, but changed. "This approach," he said slowly, "is not part of the current curriculum." It was not a criticism. It was an acknowledgement. Sarah gave a small nod. "It is usually introduced later," she replied. "Or not at all." A faint ripple of reaction moved through the class, not confusion this time, but understanding. Harrington exhaled quietly, then picked up the chalk, but instead of correcting or replacing her work, he added a small notation beside it, reinforcing what she had done rather than challenging it. It was a subtle shift, but one that every student noticed. The authority in the room had not disappeared, it had evolved. A student raised his hand slowly, his voice more careful than before. "Professor, is this method more efficient?" Harrington glanced at Sarah briefly, then back at the board. "In certain cases," he answered, "it is superior." The word hung in the air, undeniable. Superior. Not equal. Not acceptable. Superior. Several students exchanged looks, the weight of that admission settling in. Sarah finally stepped back from the board, returning the chalk to its place with the same quiet motion as before. She did not smile. She did not seek validation. She simply turned, preparing to return to the space she had occupied earlier, the space that now felt very different from what it had been. But before she could take more than a step, Harrington spoke again. "Ms. Mitchell." His voice stopped her, not sharply, but with intention. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. For a brief moment, the room held its breath again, waiting to see what would come next. Harrington paused, as if weighing his words more carefully than he ever had in this room. "It appears," he said, "that I may have overlooked more than just a step in that equation." The statement was quiet, but its meaning was clear. It was not a full apology. Not yet. But it was something far more rare in a room like this. Recognition. And as Sarah stood there, calm and composed, the balance that had once defined this space had shifted completely, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to authority, but to truth. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, not because they were loud, but because of who had said them, and what they implied. Professor Harrington, a man who rarely conceded anything, had just admitted, in his own measured way, that he had been wrong. Not entirely, not explicitly, but enough for every person in that room to understand the shift that had taken place. Sarah Mitchell did not respond immediately. She simply held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression calm, unreadable, as if she had heard words like that before, or perhaps had stopped expecting them altogether. Then she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as triumph, but as acknowledgement, and turned to return to her place near the back wall. This time, the silence that followed her was not heavy or uncertain. It was deliberate. Respectful. Every step she took seemed to echo differently now, not as an interruption, but as a presence that had been fully recognized. Students who had barely noticed her before now watched closely, some with curiosity, others with something deeper, a quiet reevaluation of everything they thought they understood about who belonged in that room. Harrington remained at the front, his posture still, his attention no longer on reclaiming authority, but on recalibrating it. He turned back to the board, studying the solution once more, but now there was no urgency in his movements, no need to prove anything further. Instead, he traced the logic again, slower this time, allowing the structure to settle not just into the class, but into himself. "There is a tendency," he said after a moment, his voice steady, "to assume that expertise always presents itself in recognizable ways." The room listened carefully. No one wrote. No one interrupted. "Titles, credentials, appearances," he continued, glancing briefly toward the back of the room where Sarah now stood once more, "they create a framework that we rely on." He paused, letting the word sit. "But frameworks," he added quietly, "are only useful until they prevent us from seeing what is actually in front of us." The message was clear, though he never said it directly. Several students shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but out of realization. The equation on the board was no longer the only lesson being taught. A student in the middle row raised his hand slowly, his voice more thoughtful than before. "Professor, would this method apply to other nonlinear systems as well?" Harrington turned slightly, considering the question, but before he could answer, his eyes moved again toward Sarah, as if acknowledging something unspoken. There was a brief pause, then he responded. "In the right context, yes," he said. "Though understanding when to apply it requires a level of insight that goes beyond standard instruction." His words were directed at the class, but their meaning reached further. Sarah did not move, did not react outwardly, but the acknowledgement was there, quiet and unmistakable. The lecture continued, but it did not return to what it had been before. The dynamic had shifted too far for that. Students asked different questions now, more precise, more engaged, less concerned with avoiding mistakes and more focused on understanding. The tension that had once filled the room had been replaced by something sharper, more alive. Harrington moved through the material with a different pace, occasionally referencing the adjustments Sarah had introduced, not as an anomaly, but as a valid extension of the concept itself. Each time he did, the room seemed to settle further into the new reality that had formed. Time passed almost unnoticed, the usual weight of the lecture replaced by a steady flow of thought and observation. When the clock finally approached the end of the session, Harrington set the chalk down one last time, turning to face the class. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze moving across the room, taking in the students who had just witnessed something they would not easily forget. Then, almost as an afterthought, but with clear intention, he spoke again. "Next session," he said, "we will expand on this approach." A few students nodded immediately, already anticipating what that would mean. Harrington paused, then added, "I would encourage all of you to review today's material carefully." Another pause. His eyes shifted once more, briefly, toward Sarah. "Especially the parts you did not expect to learn." The room went quiet again, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding. As students began to gather their things, the usual sounds of movement returned, but even those felt different, more subdued, more thoughtful. Conversation started, but they were quieter, more focused, as if everyone was still processing what had just taken place. And near the back of the room, Sarah Mitchell remained for a moment longer, standing in the same place she had begun, yet no longer the same in the eyes of those around her. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. And yet, without trying, she had changed the entire room. And as she finally turned to leave, one thing had become undeniably clear to everyone who had witnessed it: respect had not been given to her that day. It had been earned, in the only way that truly matters. The lecture hall did not empty the way it usually did, not with the usual rush of footsteps and casual conversations, but slowly, almost reluctantly, as if no one wanted to be the first to break away from what had just unfolded. Groups of students lingered near their seats, voices low, eyes still drifting back toward the board where Sarah's solution remained untouched, as though erasing it would somehow erase the moment itself. A few of them glanced toward the back of the room, where Sarah Mitchell was gathering her clipboard, her movements quiet and unhurried, as if the weight of what had happened did not rest on her at all. But it did. Just not in the way they expected. One student finally stepped away from his seat and approached her, hesitant at first, then more certain with each step. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful, respectful in a way it had not been earlier. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze without tension. "That method you used," he continued, "I have never seen it explained that clearly before." There was no arrogance in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Sarah offered a small, polite nod. "It becomes clearer with practice," she said simply. The answer was modest, almost understated, but it carried a quiet confidence that made it feel complete. Another student joined them, then another, forming a small circle that would have been unthinkable less than an hour ago. "Were you part of the graduate program?" one asked. "How long ago?" another added. Their questions overlapped slightly, not chaotic, but eager, as if they were trying to piece together a story that had suddenly become important to them. Sarah listened, her expression steady, then answered without embellishment. "A few years ago," she said. "I did not finish the path I started." The phrasing was deliberate, not an admission of failure, but a recognition of change. The students exchanged glances, their assumptions shifting once again. Before anyone could ask more, a different presence approached, one that carried a familiar weight, though it felt altered now. "Professor Harrington." The small group instinctively stepped aside, creating space without being asked. The room seemed to quiet again, even though it was nearly empty. Harrington stopped a few feet from Sarah, not imposing, not towering, just present. For a moment, he said nothing, as if choosing his words with care, something he had not needed to do earlier that morning. Ms. Mitchell, he began, his tone measured, but no longer edged with superiority, your insight today was significant. The pause before the final word made it clear that he had considered others, and rejected them. Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without reacting beyond that. Harrington continued, his gaze steady. I would like to understand more about your work, he said. If you are willing. It was not a command. It was not even an expectation. It was an offer, one that carried a quiet shift in power that everyone present could feel. Sarah held his gaze for a moment, considering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. I do not do formal work anymore, she replied calmly. The response was not dismissive, but it set a boundary, clear and respectful. Harrington absorbed this without interruption, then nodded once. Even so, he said, what you demonstrated today has value here. He gestured lightly toward the room, the board, the institution itself. More than you may realize. Sarah's eyes flickered briefly toward the board, then back to him. Value is not always decided in rooms like this, she said quietly. The statement landed with a different kind of weight, one that did not challenge, but expanded the conversation beyond its usual limits. Harrington did not respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to consider her words more deeply than anything that had been said during the lecture. Around them, the remaining students stood still, listening, not out of obligation, but because something real was being said, something that reached beyond equations and into something far less defined, but far more important. After a moment, Harrington nodded again, slower this time. That may be true, he admitted. Another pause followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Then, with a quiet shift in tone, he added. But sometimes, the right room simply has not been recognized yet. The implication lingered between them, subtle but unmistakable. Sarah did not answer right away. She looked at him, then at the room, as if seeing it not as it had been, but as it could be. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of possibility. Finally, she gave a small, thoughtful nod. Not agreement. Not refusal. Something in between. And as the last few students began to leave, casting one final look back at the board and at her, it became clear that the moment they had witnessed was not an ending, but a beginning of something none of them had expected to see, and perhaps not yet ready to fully understand. By the time Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the lecture hall, the air outside felt different, quieter, as if the world beyond those walls had not yet caught up to what had just taken place inside. The corridor stretched long and polished, lined with glass panels that reflected passing students, but none of them moved quite the same way anymore. A few who had been in the lecture slowed as they saw her, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, their expressions shifting into something thoughtful, something that had replaced the earlier certainty they once carried. Sarah walked calmly, her clipboard held lightly at her side, her pace unhurried, unchanged. She did not look back. She did not need to. Behind her, the echo of that room still lingered, not as noise, but as understanding. Inside the lecture hall, Professor Harrington remained for a moment longer after everyone had left, standing alone in front of the board that still displayed her work. The equations had not been erased. He had not touched them. Instead, he studied them again, tracing the lines slowly, not searching for error this time, but for depth. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft lines across the board, illuminating the difference between what had been taught and what had been revealed. For years, he had believed that mastery was something that could be measured, defined by credentials, by recognition, by the structure of academia itself. But what he had witnessed did not fit neatly into that structure. It challenged it. He exhaled quietly, setting the chalk down once more, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. In that room. Not doubt. Not defeat. Perspective. Meanwhile, down the corridor, Sarah approached a service cart parked neatly against the wall, a reminder of the role everyone had assumed she belonged to. She paused briefly, her fingers resting on the handle, not as someone returning to a lesser place, but as someone who had never seen it that way to begin with. A young student who had followed her at a distance finally spoke, his voice careful. "You really changed something back there," he said. Sarah glanced at him, her expression soft but steady. "No," she replied quietly. "It was always there." The student frowned slightly, processing her words, then nodded, as if understanding more than he could fully explain. Back in the lecture hall, Harrington reached for his notebook, flipping through pages filled with years of work, published ideas, carefully constructed proofs. Yet none of them felt as immediate as what had happened that morning. He stopped on a blank page, hesitated for a moment, then began to write, not copying her solution, but expanding on it, building from it, allowing it to reshape his own thinking. The room was silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a place that had just been opened. Outside, Sarah continued down the hallway, passing by offices and classrooms, unnoticed by some, quietly acknowledged by others. A faculty member who had once passed her without a glance now paused, offering a small nod of respect. She returned it just as simply, without emphasis, without expectation. Her presence had not changed in form, but in meaning. She was still the same person who had walked into that lecture hall earlier that morning, dressed the same, carrying the same clipboard, moving with the same quiet composure. But the way the world saw her had shifted, and more importantly, the way they saw themselves had shifted with it. As she reached the exit doors, the sunlight outside spilling across the floor in warm, steady lines, she paused for just a second, not to reflect on what she had done, but on what she had not needed to do. She had not argued. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. And yet, everything had changed. Behind her, in a room that had once been defined by authority and assumption, a new understanding had taken root, one that would not easily fade. And as Sarah stepped out into the open air, leaving the building behind her, one quiet truth remained, lingering in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Sometimes the greatest impact does not come from proving others wrong, but from revealing what they failed to see all along. In the days that followed, the lecture hall at Westbridge University did not return to what it had been, even though the schedule remained the same, the students filled the same seats, and Professor Harrington stood at the same board. Something subtle but permanent had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone or ignored. The equation Sarah Mitchell had written that morning had long been erased, but its presence lingered in every discussion, in every question that was now asked with more care, more curiosity, and less fear. Students who once focused only on avoiding mistakes now leaned into complexity, no longer intimidated by the possibility of being wrong, because they had witnessed something far more important than perfection. They had seen truth emerge from the most unexpected place. Harrington himself had changed, though not in ways that were immediately obvious to an outsider. His lectures were still precise, still demanding, but there was a difference in his pauses now, a space where he allowed thought to form rather than forcing it into structure. Occasionally, he would reference alternative approaches, methods that were not in the textbook, and each time he did, the room would grow just a little quieter, as if everyone understood where that openness had come from. He never spoke her name again during those lectures, but he did not need to. The memory of that moment had already become part of the room itself. Across campus, the story spread, not as gossip, but as something closer to quiet admiration. A few students tried to find her, asking around, checking schedules, hoping to learn more, but Sarah Mitchell remained exactly where she had always been, moving through the hallways with the same calm presence, unnoticed by many, acknowledged by a few. She did not step into the spotlight that had briefly found her. She did not return to the lecture hall as a student or a lecturer. She simply continued her work, steady and unchanging, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But for those who had been there, nothing was the same. One afternoon, as the light filtered through the tall windows once again, Harrington stood alone in the lecture hall after class, much like he had that day. He looked at the board, now filled with a new set of equations, but his gaze was distant, thoughtful. For a long moment, he said nothing, then quietly, almost to himself, he spoke. We measure intelligence by what we recognize, he said, his voice low in the empty room. But recognition is limited by expectation. The words lingered, not meant for an audience, but carrying a weight that would have been understood by anyone who had been there before. He picked up a piece of chalk, hesitated, then wrote a small note in the corner of the board, not part of the lesson, not something that would be graded or tested. Just a single line. A reminder. Then he stepped back, studying it briefly before setting the chalk down again. Outside, Sarah walked across the campus grounds, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pathways. Students passed by, some recognizing her now, offering small nods, quiet greetings, gestures that had not existed before. She returned them with the same calm acknowledgement, never drawing attention, never holding on to it. She did not need to. Because what had been proven did not require repetition. It had already been seen. And as she continued forward, disappearing gradually into the flow of campus life, one quiet truth remained, not just in that lecture hall, but in every person who had witnessed what happened that day, that brilliance does not announce itself, it does not demand recognition, and it does not rely on appearance to be real. It simply exists, waiting for the moment when someone is willing to see it. And sometimes, that moment changes everything.